1860, Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln received a dismal 1.4% of the vote in Frederick County, Maryland, a quintessential borderland bounded on the north by the Mason-Dixon line and on the south by the Potomac River. That election year, the editor of the Frederick Examiner, a constitutional unionist newspaper, asserted that Maryland, quote, will protect and defend slavery with as much determination as will South Carolina. 4 years later, however, Lincoln won Frederick County decisively, garnering 61% of the votes cast, and a majority of voters there approved a new state constitution that outlawed slavery, an institution the Examiner now labeled, quote, antagonistic to Christian civilization and the Declaration of Independence. Many white residents of the South's outer reaches had come to embrace positions they would have deemed unthinkable before the clash of Union and Confederate armies demanded that they weigh competing values and cast their lot with one of two feuding regions. At the center of this story lie the far-reaching effects and the limitations of slavery's power to shape society and politics along the geographic fringes of that institution's existence. Having constituted 1/6 of the county's population in 1820, enslaved African Americans accounted for only 7% in 1860. Yet the presence of slavery made a tremendous difference even where it did not dominate the economy. In Frederick, slave owners and traders bought and sold their property at a thriving market near the Potomac River. Black families were often dispersed upon their master's death. Slave catchers chased runaways heading toward the Pennsylvania line, and white citizens eyed black gatherings with distrust. Slaveholders conducted a brisk trade in term slaves who were to be manumitted after a certain number of years, and in enslaved blacks who were hired out annually. Other masters exercised their right to liberate their slaves when they became economically burdensome or when moral scruples triggered a benevolent impulse. On the eve of the Civil War, 60% of the county's black population was free. The existence of slavery had created a web of social relations in which masters, non-slaveholders, slaves, and free blacks each asserted and negotiated for as much authority or autonomy as they could achieve. At the same time, Frederick Countyans did, in the aggregate, display some patterns of behavior that had more in common with the North than with the South. Household heads were more likely to own their own land. There was a considerable Catholic presence. Industrial output, though secondary to agriculture, was significant. And the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad integrated the county into a northern network of trade. Yet in public discourse, white residents often use the term northern to describe people or ideas they considered distasteful. As the sectional conflict intensified, Frederick Countyans uniformly identified their culture, their interests, and themselves as Southern. Local publications, those that later sided with the Union as well as those that advocated secession, routinely referred to their, quote, sister states of the South, cited their natural alliance to our brethren of the whole South, and used the words us and the South interchangeably. No native citizen of Adams County, Pennsylvania, just across the Mason-Dixon line, would have called himself a Southerner. The artificial boundary that marked the limit of slavery's legality served as a cultural boundary as well. Throughout the politically contentious 1850s, public criticism of slavery was virtually non-existent in Frederick, and neither of the county's political parties trumpeted the benefits of free labor. Instead, Whigs and their successor parties competed with Democrats to prove to local voters that their party was best equipped and most determined to protect Southern interests from Northern interference. Local candidates tried to discredit their opponents by accusing them, falsely, of harboring abolitionist sentiments. Consensus among white residents held that a presidential victory by the so-called black Republicans would be nothing short of a, quote, national calamity. When Aaron Davis of Fredericktown cast his vote for Lincoln in 1860, bystanders at the polls yelled that they, quote, smelt nigger in the crowd, and an angry mob stoned his house. The prospect of a Republican administration was abhorrent to white Frederick Countyans for a variety of reasons. Prominent among them, the fear that it might result in the dissolution of the Union. Repeated public articulation of the Southern regional identity did not diminish reverence for the Union, which was every bit as widespread in Frederick County as was contempt for abolitionists. White residents of Frederick described the nation bequeathed by the founders as hallowed, holy, and sublime, patriot generation had left their descendants a priceless boon by writing a sacred constitution that established a free Republican government and protected property rights. Throughout the 1850s and the presidential campaign of 1860, no one in Frederick County publicly advocated secession as a means of saving the South from northern intrusions. For every party, the all-important goal was to secure Southern rights within the Union. Residents dreaded, almost could not imagine, the prospect of choosing between the two. After Lincoln's election, the secession of several Southern states and the bombardment of Fort Sumter, followed by the President's call for troops and the secession of neighboring Virginia, Frederick citizens were forced to decide what they valued most. Roughly 1/3 of white residents cast their lot with the Confederacy. Their rhetoric and actions make clear that they perceive the crisis at its most fundamental level to be a contest between regions, between a cultural North and a cultural South. Whether or not they personally owned slaves, they were motivated by a fervent belief that Lincoln's government posed a mortal threat to Southern white men's power over blacks, both enslaved and free. Moreover, they argued that the Constitution did not authorize the federal government to force individual states to remain in the Union, and they proudly compared themselves to members of the Revolutionary generation who had courageously denied British authority. Confederate sympathizers asserted that true patriotism, true adherence to the ideals of the founders, required withdrawal from a union that had corrupted the very principles on which it had been built. The other 2/3 of the white population remained loyal to the Union. In their view, the primary issue was whether to keep the nation intact or allow it to disintegrate. The question is not one of sectional sympathy, of choice between the North and South, the Frederick Examiner explained, but whether we shall stand fast by the government and free institutions of our fathers or plunge the state into revolution and ruin. Regularly invoking a glorious past in which brilliant, far-sighted men had risked their lives to secure liberty and prosperity for future generations, Frederick loyalists warned that dismantling the fruits of the founders' labor would signal to the rest of the world that Republican government was not durable. Anarchy, the rise of petty kingdoms, or worst of all, slavery to a foreign despot, might be the results of a failure to defeat the secessionists. Crucially, Unionists advanced these arguments as self-proclaimed Southerners, who made clear that they had chosen the Union and not the North. Their rhetoric revealed no identification with the North as a region, but rather emphasized that Southern interests would be best served within the Union. Unionists complained that secession had placed border state slavery in, quote, jeopardy of annihilation. Slavery would not be able to survive the massive upheaval that would ensue if a Confederate Maryland formed a wedge between the remaining states of the Union and their national capital, bringing the war to the doorstep of the county. A meeting of Unionists declared themselves struck with astonishment that many of the slaveholders of Maryland advocate secession because a more effectual mode could not be adopted if they desire the abolition of slavery. A Union convention at Frederick in May 1861 vowed that Marylanders would oppose any attempt by the federal government to inject abolitionism into a war being waged solely for the purpose of saving the nation. And a Unionist newspaper grumbled in July about the, quote, abolitionist fanatics who infest the capital. Despite shared Southern identity and opposition to interference with slavery, Confederate